So a continuous wave of wars has plagued the MENA region both physically and mentally. And apart from death counts and suicide statistics, a burgeoning emphasis is now being placed on the mechanisms of these political conflicts and how they affect healthcare chains of supply and demand. Gaza's hospitals and homes are still in shambles a year after the latest offensive, now 2 years. But relief efforts must also be placed on the enduring and glaring restriction on mobility that is the hallmark of the occupation, which prevents medical students from traveling abroad to specialize and patients from accessing points of care. Hospitals and ambulances in Syria are being targeted by government and foreign forces alike, despite maintaining neutrality and treating victims on both sides. The escalating conflict in Yemen has put more pressure on the health system, where an already isolated and vulnerable population is suffering from lack of food and basic necessities. Egypt has the highest rate of hepatitis C in the world, due to in large part a grave error made in a massive government vaccination campaign for systemiasis, where over 10% of the population became infected by unsterile needles. The displacement and uprooting of civilians from their homes all across the region as a result of these wars has caused one of the most severe refugee movements in modern history, rippling demographics across the globe. But healthcare is not just measured in mortality statistics or disease prevalence. National health systems are highly influenced by the political climate surrounding them, and as Norwegian physician and activist Mads Gilbert puts it, medicine and politics are Siamese twins. Bridging these multi-sectorial arguments together will be essential in making the case for peace and for change.
It is then our great honor to briefly introduce our esteemed speakers and moderator here today. So we have Dr. Mazen Al-Habshi, a Yemeni physician working with the International Committee of the Red Cross as a health delegate in Somalia, managing the pre-hospital program. He has more than 5 years experience of working in different health programs in Yemen, including primary health care and emergency response. Dr. Al-Habshi was the curator of the TEDx Sana'a and the TEDx Ambassador of the Middle East, and one of the founders of the House of Ideas Foundation. He holds a medical degree from Sana'a University in Yemen and is currently enrolled in the MPH program in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Dr. Mahmoud Hariri is a Syrian general and trauma surgeon who is the scientific vice dean at the Aleppo University Faculty of Medicine, as well as the research director at the Union of Syrian Medical Relief Organizations, or USAM. Dr. Hariri's research has been focused on the capacity of Syrian hospitals in providing trauma care, while also delving into other factors contributing to mortality in the Syrian war. Dr. Hariri holds an MD and a master's in surgery from Aleppo University and is currently a fellow at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative here in Boston through the Scholar at Risk program at the Harvard School of Public Health.
Third, we have Dr. Hatem Kannane, who is a Palestinian doctor who has worked for over 35 years to bring medical care to Palestinians in Galilee against a culture of anti-Arab discrimination. He is the author of A Doctor in Galilee, The Life and Struggle of a Palestinian in Israel. His collection of short stories entitled Chief Complaint was just released by Just World Books in the spring of 2015. Dr. Kannane holds an MD and an MPH from Harvard. We also have Dr. Kannane's books available for you here today if anyone is interested after the panel, as well as his latest article, which is entitled Health, Sumud, Settler Colonialism, and the Layers of Elimination in Historical Palestine. And lastly, our moderator here today is Dr. Ahmed Shalbaya. He is the founder of the Nada Foundation for Safer Egyptian Roads and has consulted with the Egyptian Ministry of Health for many years regarding the hepatitis C epidemic and is currently working on the first large-scale program to document the extent of the Hep C crisis in Egypt. He is also the Director of Economics and Outcomes Research at Pfizer and a senior lecturer at the Global Health School at Columbia University. Dr. Shalbaya holds an MD and an MS in Pediatrics from the Cairo University of Medicine and an MPH in Health Policy and Management from Columbia University. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Shalbaya.
Thank you, Zahra. Thank you, Taha. And welcome everybody to this session, Caught in Crossfire, Healthcare in the MENA countries. And as Zahra mentioned, the mention of the Middle East these days brings into the imagination right away the images of war, destruction, and most importantly, the suffering of people. And specifically the concern of this session, the suffering related to health. There are many terms that describe such situations, whether it's in the literature, whether it's complex emergencies, fragile states, unstable states, protracted crises, high or low level intensities. So the myriad of definitions just defines and describes the variety and the vagueness of the situation in each of them. However, there are commonalities in most of them. The disintegration and the deterioration and the fragmentation of healthcare delivery, the loss of knowledge and the deterioration of skills, the stress of security on healthcare personnel delivering services. And it's impossible to understand the determinants of health and the health status of these populations, as Zahra mentioned and the colleagues, without taking into consideration the context within which these healthcare deliveries are in place. Today we have, as Zahra mentioned, 3 distinguished guests. They are very active, they are in the field, they have their hands over the pulse, understanding what's happening in the field, so they will give us a flavor and a taste of what's happening in those countries, whether it's Palestine, Yemen, Syria, but definitely it's not just these 3 or 4 countries that we're speaking about today, they are just a reflection of other places as well. We know what's happening in Libya, Somalia, we forget that in many instances. So we'll use their experiences and what they present in order to also examine other aspects. Today's session, we'll try to make it as much as possible discussion-oriented. We'll also open it to questions from the audience down, but we'll start first by a quick presentation by the colleagues on the panel on the situation in the countries where they are working. A quick presentation, after which we will move towards the discussion aspect of the presentation. And we'll start with Dr. Hariri to give us a quick context and understanding of what's happening on the ground in Syria.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hello everybody, and thank you for hosting me here in Harvard. Okay, now? Okay. Thank you for Harvard Arabs. And thank you for Harvard. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me, listening to what's going on in Syria. I'm general surgeon from Aleppo, working in Aleppo, and I'm ex-faculty member in Aleppo University, graduated from UK and from Aleppo University. I'm going to talk rapidly about healthcare system in Syria. Why? This is my first and last question, will be for everybody listening to me. Okay, I will tell you something about this why. I have only 8 minutes, unfortunately. Okay, do you know how many medical personnel has been killed in Syria? According to Physicians for Human Rights, this number by June 2016, the number is higher. And this is the number of health facility also by June has been out of service and targeted. Yesterday, for example, 2 hospitals, one in Kafr Zeta and one in rural Aleppo has been targeted and now out of service. It is a trend. Why? Just to keep dictator in power. This is why. Continuous bombardment for all health facilities lead to fled a lot of doctors or killing a lot of staff, lead to almost total health system collapsed. This is my colleague, Dr. Wasim, is killed in one of our hospitals. I think the media concentrate and focus on this guy. Is my real friend and close friend. And this is one of our hospitals after being targeted. Imagine that you are a doctor working in underground hospital with these sandbags around you, under no electricity and intensive bombardment, daily basis. Yesterday, more than 13 attacks, for example, on close to my hospital in Aleppo. Just example, just one day. Okay. So, what's our reflect? I used to talk about pain, but always I talk in positive manner about hope. There is hope, and we are building ourselves, we are building our country, and we are going for education. I will concentrate here positively on what's going on the ground in medical education per se. We started Aleppo University in spite of situation in Syria. Aleppo University now is 10 faculty. One of them is Faculty of Medicine. We have more than 500 medical students in different years, first, second, and third year. This year we enrolled more than 150 in different branches, sometimes mobile university. But we have some challenges. And even lectures, we are giving lectures online. Just now I came from my house, one of the online lectures has finished. There is virtual learning for our student. The teacher is in Chicago, and the student, some of them in Damascus, and some in rural Aleppo. And also, we're trying to build some collaboration with some university. This image from Yale University, there is some collaboration now with Yale University, Albany University, Johns Hopkins University, and we are trying to make some collaboration with Harvard University. What is our challenges? The most difficult challenges is security. Now, the teaching is suspended this week in all over Syria due to intensive attack to the faculty itself. Last week, medical school has been targeted and we lost more than 15,000 book reference in the city. We started also postgraduate training with Syrian Board of Medical Specialties, and many students now, residents, graduate, some of them surgeons, and now going through the pipeline and they are working in Syria. Why? You know why? To build ourselves. There is one very famous jail in Syria called Tadmor Jail. Our ambition is to make this place Harvard. And hopefully we will do it. This is our way and the answer of our why. During this time, we are working to build our country. This is my last message. Syrians don't like to be refugees anywhere in the world. We need to be back home and work in our home and build our country. We hate this word, refugees. We don't like to be immigrant. And we are able to build our future if this chance are given to us. This is our liberty statue, has been built from our building. This is the real statue of liberty. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hariri, for the quick overview, which I think it needs not just hours, it needs days for description, but we'll try as much as possible to touch upon these issues.
Thank you.
We're going to get also a flavor of what's happening on the ground in Yemen. So Dr. Mazen, please give us.
First of all, I want to thank the organizers for the interest to listen, for the invitation and the interest to listen about Yemen. Okay. Now, better. And thank you all for attending, and please excuse my English. Before I go into my presentation, I want to give a brief about what's the context, the politics that's happening in Yemen. So we all know that in 2015 there was a bombing that began, and the coalition that began the military campaign in Yemen. But this is not the event that the point that where the health structure began to suffer. Since 2004, there was a series of conflicts in Yemen. In the north, in the south, several militias, tribe conflicts with the government that began to affect the health system. That's already weak. Yemen is considered to be the poorest Arab country. We're suffering from a lot of, backsteps in the health system, in the policy, in the structures, and so on. So I'll brief. In 2011, the situation in Yemen deteriorated more with the Arab Spring, and through the situation that through the revolution, the country began to suffer from a lot of conflicts that was happening in the north, in the south. More than 1 million IDP, internal displaced people were displaced during that time. So I'm sorry, there's a problem with my slides. So Yemen is the poorest Arab country. The health system was already crippled. The population is more than 26 million. We're having the under 5 mortality rate is 51 for 1,000 live birth. The maternal mortality rate is 270. $202 is the annual expenditure in the health per capita. We have now currently 1.4 million internal displaced around the country. This is beside what happened from 2004 until now. 19.3 million lack adequate access to clean water. Yemen is considered to be one of the most water scarce countries. We're suffering from a lot of. We're suffering from the water deficient. We lack adequate access to clean water. This is coming from the north to south. We have 14.4 million food. Sorry, I'm going back to the script. Yemen has the highest rate of chronic malnutrition after Afghanistan. About half the population live in deep poverty. More than half of the children under 5 suffer from chronic malnutrition. With current, there's different data coming from the UNICEF and WHO indicating that the GAM and the SAM levels are increasing before the pre-conflict era. We currently have about 2 million acutely malnourished, including 1.3 million children. 320,000 of them are suffering from severe acute malnutrition. An estimates of 7 million people facing hunger. Sorry. There's 14.1 million people lacking sufficient access to health care. This is the status that I gathered from the WHO recently. More than 600 health facilities had closed, and this is suffering from damage or lack of fuel, staff, supplies, etc. 69 health facilities have been reported partially or damaged. 27 ambulances have been hijacked, and more than 190 health facilities stopped providing their nutrition services. This data is a glimpse. The reality is much more. There's 7,000 civilians that's been killed. This is data that's been recorded. And more than 33,000 have been injured. There's 6,000 amputees due to the conflict. The data and the data recording is decreasing from 95 to 79%. This is the data that's been collected by the government. That means there is a big gap now happening in the health sector. In last month, the Ministry of Health announced confirmed cases of cholera in Sana'a. And now it's not only in Sana'a, in the capital, but also in Taiz and Aden, which is two of the big cities. There is now, this conflict is putting its effect on the communicable diseases. So we can see now it's happening in the effect that's happening with the cholera, but also there's a big records of dengue fever. And just 1 week last month, there was a record of more than 400 cases, just in 1 week. Not to forget also that the weak structure, or the weak system that's already been there and now being affected by the conflict have been affecting the non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and hypertension, which are mainly those patients are depending on the government, which stopped such programs as have been stopped. Last week, the WHO reported that more than 50% of the health facilities have stopped functioning. And this is a huge indicator that the health system in Yemen is on the glimpse of collapsing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mazen. One of the interesting things in public health is how to translate the figures and numbers into faces and the experience of human suffering. So the numbers are staggering, but definitely sometimes that gets lost in translation of the real suffering, and especially in places where already the infrastructure is suffering from decades and decades of neglect. We're now going to be hearing a different experience in terms of a crisis or a complex emergency, which has its peculiarity. It has its length in terms of years of suffering or challenges in order to deal with it, and it's the Palestinian case. Dr. Hatem will honor us with giving us, again, a flavor quickly of what's happening on the ground. And then from there, we'll be moving to more of the discussions and touching upon the different points as much as possible.
Thank you, and thank you all for attending this session. To start with, I am a retired public health physician. I am a Palestinian citizen of Israel. When I came out of retirement to do this talk and to write a paper, which I understand is available somewhere on the seat in the back. Unfortunately, I just realized the paper doesn't carry my name. So I guess when you are telling universal truths, you don't need a name of an author. So when I faced this task of trying to speak of the Palestinian healthcare, at this stage. Of course, the Palestinians are divided into so many administrative segments, which is actually a sign of the success of the Zionist settler colonial scheme, that we have been divided into so many different parts. I faced this task, and I decided to try and find a unifying thread. And that unifying thread is actually given by the conception, the political science concept of what Israel is and what has done to the Palestinians. Israel is the longest ongoing and still active settler colonial project. And the Palestinians have to face up to that kind of attitude by their masters. And I'm now talking only about the Palestinians within historical Palestine. The three segments. One is the Palestinian citizens of Israel, like myself. The second is the occupied Palestinian territories of Jerusalem and the West Bank. And the third is the Gaza Strip. Now, what unifies all of these parts of the Palestinian people is actually the fact that they are all subjects of the settler colonial state of Israel at some level, and the political scientists speak of the logic of elimination of the settler colonialists. Logic of elimination meaning either by eliminating the life or pushing out the people. And this is what Israel has practiced in all three segments that I am talking about. The Palestinians within Israel proper, we suffer from essentially neglect. The Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Jerusalem suffer really from active interference of the system in their daily lives, in the way they conduct their daily lives, to the degree that it is actually unhealthy. And the worst group, of course, are the people of Gaza. The estimate of the international community is that Gaza will be unlivable in 4 years from now. Now, Israel in Gaza practices the process of elimination, whether we're talking about the closure and the prevention of arrival of goods and food and so on, or the occasional, what Israeli generals call mowing of the lawn. Every few years, you go in and kill some more children and adults and so on. And so what did the Palestinians do about that? They have started or have always actually practiced what I call the logic of sumud, which is to hunker down and really do your best to survive. I will give a very small example of that from my community. In 1970, when I returned to my village in the Galilee, I was the first and only physician, Western-trained physician there. By now, the community really has one of the highest number of physicians per capita or per 1,000 residents anywhere in the world. We have about 70 to 100 physicians, one physician for 70 to 100 population, something unimaginable, the numbers we have. The process of producing a Palestinian physician within Israel is not that simple. First of all, we are very, very impeded in admission to the Israeli universities. So everybody puts their heads together and shoulder to shoulder, and the father, the grown children, and even the uncles and grandparents, they all pool their resources and send the younger one abroad to study medicine, of course. And that is how come we got to this point. The last thing I will say is that the military outlook and practice of Israel towards the Palestinians has started harming the Israeli system itself. In a sense, anybody who reads a recent article by Eva Elouz, who is a social scientist from Tel Aviv University, she describes how the militarization of the entire life of the community of Israel has really rendered, has taken away the humanitarian basis of medicine in Israel and turned it to a struggle of power struggle between the healthcare providers and the patients. In a way, this is really, it gives you a flavor of how Israel relates not only to the Palestinians, but to its own population. And I thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer questions and to sign my book that is outside, okay?
Thank you, Dr. Hatem. I think one of the amazing things that we're hearing is the adaptability of the healthcare personnel or even the system to the situation. But let me start with Dr. Hariri, and you've given us some sense of the situation in terms of the health system variables, healthcare workers, what they are suffering from, the hospitals and the bombing. Could you give us a little bit of understanding of the health status of the population, especially that we understand in Syria there are different factions, different rebels, the government is controlling different areas. So what's the health status of the different populations? And are there more and more vulnerable populations that are getting more of the hit relative to others?
Well, I've got an idea about opposition-controlled area, so I was living there. The people, as far as you know, there is more than millions of people are moving from place to place, which is make all of those people vulnerable. Apart from trauma, I'm a surgeon, so I concentrate on trauma and talking about a lot of trauma, but there is some hidden side, which is chronic patient, chronic diseases, malignant patient, dialysis patient, for example. Those patients are suffering a lot. We are trying to work on data collection, makes some paper in order to raise awareness about what's happening in Syria. We finished a paper about diabetes patient, for example, and how those patients are suffering from deficiency from their own medication, how many times able to get their own medications, how they have access to primary health care. Vaccination, for example, we have now again back to polio. Imagine that polio now back. Imagine the historical disease like tuberculosis now, it's back. Imagine about cholera, imagine a lot of diseases now due to, there is everything not available, especially in BCHD area. Aleppo, for example, I give you just an example from my city, which is my beloved city, I was living there. Imagine you have 300,000 persons, all of them, almost all of them are civilians, are suffering from everything. The price of liter of diesel, which is here for $1 or $2, it is there more than $100. There is no cars, no ambulance, no food, no flour for bread. Everything is not available.
How was that reflected on the infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, the health indicators that we usually follow,
We try to keep some reserve, for example, for baby milk below 6 months old, just an example, but now it's out. Imagine also that every person have got a leaf of bread every 3 days. This is your right. We have some reserve of flour. We're trying to distribute this flour on the days just to keep it as long as possible. We don't know for how. This is the first time in the century that starvation is a weapon. Besieging innocent people, besieging a baby is crying now, looking for a bottle of milk. Imagine the feeling of father who's now running away, just looking for a piece of bottle of milk just to give it for his baby. This is what's happening. This is the weapon which is used now. And the shame is from international community. Let us say this. Why? I'd like to repeat my question. Why? Why the international community are silent since 4 or 5 years now? And the shame, United Nations supporting Assad regime, fueling the war. This is what's happening in Syria, unfortunately. But in spite of this, I will repeat again, we will never lose our hope. We are able to build our country. Just help us to do that.
It's very interesting when I hear, friends back from the country saying that you're a physician, you're not supposed to be talking about politics. Just focus on what you're doing every day. But it just demonstrates how it is very hard to divorce politics, economics, culture, and its relationship to health.
It's impossible.
So definitely, and it definitely is very evident on how you're speaking about aspects related to nutrition and politics impacting health. But one of the interesting things that I heard from you is related to diabetes and patients, and I would like to hear from Dr. Mazen. Do you think in Yemen, given the conflict that is going there, and we always hear about the change of the epidemiology of different diseases, we're showing history of acute infectious diseases that are over, and now more of chronic diseases. Is that reversing? Is that staying the same? Are they both increasing, chronic diseases like diabetes and heart diseases, as well as acute infectious diseases in Yemen? Or what's the dynamics happening on the ground?
It's quite interesting what's happening in Yemen currently, because we can see both of them are happening and both of them are increasing. We had a program that was supporting the non-communicable disease like diabetes, and for instance, there is the country does not have, and this is where the link comes from, the country, for instance, the petrol, the electricity, the capability of sustaining the infrastructure to, for instance, we all know that insulin needs to be kept cooled down, so we don't have the electricity to keep it stored. We don't have the fuel to run the transportation. So yes, this is affecting all the lack of infrastructure, and the interesting part, all Yemen is under a siege. It's not areas or pockets. We're not capable of getting our commodities in or out. Food, medicine is not coming in. Yemen is dependent, 90% of Yemen is dependent on exports. This is not, there's a big, huge problem in that. When we talk about communicable diseases, for instance, cholera, now it's coming back in cities which are considered having some kind of infrastructure, water, electricity, it's not there. So it's a big problem now happening there, and not only it's in different cities, different diseases. When we talk about dengue, for instance. There's a big numbers coming in, malaria, infectious diseases, and the problem also is we're not capable of recording, getting the information like before. There's a lack of recording this information, starting it, reporting to the Ministry of Health, which also put us in another gap which we don't know what's happening on the ground.
That's also very interesting, and again, it demonstrates probably again the rise of cholera, and you mentioned cases of dengue fever, the issue of clean water, aspects that you would imagine that those Arab countries have passed that stage. I suppose Palestine is a different situation, and you did point out that there are three different scenarios that we could look at. Dr. Hariri, how would you describe the different populations in terms of the distribution of types of diseases, non-communicable versus infectious versus the epidemiology of it?
Well, let me say that I am best informed about my own group, which is the Palestinian Citizens of Israel. Having said that, still, let me mention that in the occupied Palestinian territories, the NGO system has taken on most of the healthcare system's duties there. And that's to the credit, again, of the Palestinian sumud. Sumud, for those who don't know Arabic, is steadfastness. So it is the community taking care of itself. Let me just mention that in terms of the statistics, the Palestinian minority in Israel, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, we are comparatively better off in terms of our health statistics than any other Palestinian group. However, that's not how I look at it. I pay taxes in Israel, and I want to have the same statistics as the majority population of Israel, because I have the same rights, presumably, although there are over 50 laws in Israel that specifically discriminate against me. So, as a result, and again, you mentioned health and politics. Of course, health is politics, or politics is health. That when we do that comparison, although our infant mortality rate, for those few who are public health, with public health background, infant mortality rate really tells the whole story of the health conditions of a population. Our infant mortality rate has, since day one, meaning 1948, that's day one for us. Since then, we have had infant mortality rate that ran exactly 2 times the infant mortality rate of the Jewish majority. 2 times. We improved, but the relative ratio has not improved till the Oslo Agreement. And that is, again, health is politics. After the Oslo Agreement, and we are not affected directly by the Oslo Agreement, but after the Oslo Agreement, the relative ratio has started rising, and we now have infant mortality rates of about 3 times as high as the Jewish infant mortality rate. I'm not saying that in the absolute numbers we are regressing. Only in relative numbers. And the Jewish population is improving much faster than I am. That is because, I'm sorry to interrupt, that's because we have now the settler colonialists, the active settlers in the West Bank and Jerusalem are turning around and dictating the policies of the state of Israel towards me. And that's how politics affects the real life situation.
And these rates, Dr. Hariri, you're referring to the 1948 populations. You're not pointing to the Gaza population?
I am talking about the close to 2 million Palestinians who are citizens of the State of Israel.
So I suppose the rates would be different for the Gaza population,
Much
the West
different.
Bank.
And as I said, the group that I represent, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, we are better off than any other group of Palestinians essentially anywhere in terms of our health statistics.
So, I'll try as much as possible to play devil's advocate as well and take, a different position as much as possible. And I'll ask you, Dr. Hariri, Dr. Hatem, a question, but also following it, I need to also understand better how the basic health services in Yemen and Syria are being delivered. So the public health services, vaccination, family planning, and other types of basic health services. But for Dr. Hatem, I want to understand, so I've heard from you the negative impact of occupation on populations. We also hear about the Palestinian Authority. What's the role of the Palestinian Authority towards its population in terms of healthcare delivery in the West Bank and Gaza, or Hamas as well in Gaza?
To the best of my understanding, and I am not the best source to speak to that issue, to the best of my understanding, those who are employed by the system, by the National Authority or by Hamas in Gaza, they have health insurance which covers their families. And in that sense, that segment is better off in a way. Of course, in both areas where there are refugee camps, in the refugee camps, UNRWA handles the health care there. And so all in all, the majority are still underserved to a great degree.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So again, taking into layers, so we'll move towards the role of the region, the international community, and how it's impacting the health care delivery within conflict areas. And before I hear from you how the basic health services are being delivered, I suppose the international donors, international NGOs have a big role in delivering some of those services. Do you notice that there are discrepancies in the amount of services, the quality of services that are delivered from one region to another, from one donor to another? Are there coordination between them in conflict areas? Dr. Hariri?
Well, this is so complicated question. It depends on the NGOs, either international or national. There are so many NGOs who are Syrian NGOs. One of them here in United States, our colleague in Syria American Medical Society, for example, will be working sometimes as a proxy for international NGOs in order to deliver services to Syrians. However, there is some sort of bias which is now clear and announced frankly by, there is so many reports has been appeared on Guardian about UN and UN assistance for Syrian, which is now declared that more than 80% of the support is going to regime areas where the most people who are suffering in opposition control area. This is unfortunately what's happening. Imagine that the United Nations supported Syrian army, regime Syrian army, because the blood bank in Syria, it's related to defense ministry. And the United Nations supporting directly or indirectly Syrian regime, supporting the armed forces of Syrian regime by this manner. Giving salaries for armed forces in Syria who are working in blood banks, sending support. This is part of bias what's happening, unfortunately. In the other hand, there's some international NGO who are working in Syria, supporting Syrians a lot, either directly or indirectly through other NGOs locally inside Syria.
in Yemen, there is a coordination, and the problem is not about, yes, there is problems in access and in reaching some areas, but it's also about getting the medical equipment, the medical drugs, the support from outside to inside. And this is a big problem all international organizations, local organizations, the Ministry of Health are facing currently. The Ministry of Health depends heavily on the primary health program in the governorates, in the districts, primary health clinics, MCH, and the vaccination programs are present. It was strong before 2015, supported by WHO. The issue now is not about the capacity is there. The issue is about how to preserve it, how to continue providing the services where you have blockage in the access, targeting the health centers, lack of the drugs and vaccination medication, which is affecting, impacting these services on the ground. In Yemen, there's a tendency, it's a culture that's a tendency that people usually go to the capital to get treatment. They don't trust the services provided them at their region. So there is a big, you can say, pressure in the main hospitals in the capital. Put on that the conflict that's happening, the big numbers of injured, the big numbers of casualties that are all pouring into one place. Yemen depends a lot in sending a lot of their patients outside of Yemen. Now with the embargo, a lot of people are not capable of going out. So this is, there is a big impact now happening on the ground.
Right. Doctor.
I will mention 2 points here in terms of the Palestinian situation and the donor community abroad, that because of the chronicity of the Palestinian situation, we're talking about 70 years of refugees, and then later on further down the line, there's since the occupation of the West Bank and Jerusalem and so on, there is what's called donor fatigue. People got tired of donating or of these communities continuing to ask for help and all of and so on. And so with that said, the majority of the NGOs within the occupied Palestinian community, they do not really rely that heavily on anymore now on international donors. The international donors, mind you, I mean, everybody who practiced that like I did for a few decades realizes that the donation comes with some conditions, with some, at least if not specified, it is sort of made, it's hinted at that we would like you to do this or to do that. And so much of the donations or the international donor community, the aid that's given comes with certain directives to do this or do that. And that's why many, and I know personally, many of the groups don't want to receive donations from certain quarters in the world. They will do with their own sumud practices and not receive the conditional support.
Can I?
Yes, please.
I would like to add, there is also a competition now happening. Before there was only Palestine, now then Palestine and Iraq. Now there is Palestine, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, Syria. So also this
Competition.
increased competition in different areas is impacting this reality.
Right.
And also donors are looking in a different way. They've been supporting this emergency responses for years and years. Now they're interested into maybe development. Why don't we sustain, and why don't we build something different in a way or another?
I must say that there has also been a surge in terms of funding, maybe not in the past 5 years or so, a surge in terms of funding for complex emergencies in general. But let me follow with you, Dr. Hatem, in terms of the impact of what was mentioned, different wars happening in the region, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, in terms of overshadowing the Palestinian struggle, the Palestinian sumud, and accordingly the impact on the health of the people.
Okay, well, I suppose one aspect of the whole issue of healthcare or the healthcare in conflict areas is first of all, there is the conflict between the concept of healthcare and the concept of conflict. I mean, after all, the principle, the essence of conflict has in it the dis-ease element. You are not healthy as long as you are in an area of conflict, regardless whether you are directly affected, injured, or not. Conflict is not healthy, mentally or socially, and often physically. And so there is that point. Then the issue of how people respond to the conflict. The biggest, very often unmentioned or unseen component is the level of psychological dis-ease, the psychological discomfort that is there even when you are not being hit, when you are not being attacked, when you are, for example, the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder in Gaza, with which lots of you are familiar. I mean, the expectation or the fear of the children in Gaza is that any minute they can be attacked, because there are drones flying every day. And so the issue does not have to be really an open attack on people to make them unhealthy. That is why. And there is tendency, and this is again going back to the donor community, the tendency for the donor community to make its donations dependent or conditional on conducting some research on the efficacy of this method of treating trauma or that method of there's the Israeli practice of kneecapping of the Palestinian children in the West Bank and Jerusalem. And there are some research going on what the best way to treat, the best way for orthopedic surgeons to treat gunshot wounds to the knee. I mean, the whole idea of medicalizing the conflict, medicalizing the outcome of the conflict, is basically wrong. What we should do is, instead of turning the Palestinian kids to experimental subjects, we should think seriously about preventing that, not allowing that to happen in the first place. And this is true across the Middle East, I'm sure. And I mean, the whole concept of health does not go well with the ongoing conflict and war. And therefore, it is in the best public health tradition, in the best public health principles, it is prevention that we should be working on, and not mending whatever injuries are
Right.
are practiced against these populations. We have to turn away from the medicalization of the conflict issues and speak about
The root cause.
peace and the prior to peace, freedom and justice. Okay?
So we'll take a few more questions within the panel, then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So, no? Oh, we have to finish? No, audience questions, okay. We'll open it up for audience questions as per Zahra. Okay. So let's take one question, few questions together, and then Zahra, how many minutes do we have?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you guys for speaking today. So it was mentioned earlier that in medicine and politics are Siamese twins. However, it seems that medical professionals' involvement in politics is limited to an activist capacity. So while this is necessary, I think it's also necessary for medical professionals to have a legislative role as well. What are your thoughts on this, and what is the path to this in conflict zones?
Hi. So my question is actually specifically for Dr. Hatem. So I recently returned from a research fellowship from Palestine and Israel, and one phenomenon I noticed was that there was a paradigm/power shift in the Israeli hospitals, where because of the surge in the Palestinian doctors that you noted, you often find Palestinian doctors treating Jewish settlers and Israeli Jewish citizens. So I was wondering, how do you think this power shift, if at all, can help bring peace to the region? Thank you.
Did you get it? So
في شفت في الباور بتاع الهوسبيتالز بيعالجوا الفلسطين اقل من يعالجوا اليهود.
اوكي.
حضرتك رايك ايه؟
السؤال الأول.
could you repeat your first question?
So what is the role for, what is the path for a medical professional? What is a medical professional's path
Medical professionals' path.
to a legislative role in conflict zones?
So there is a relationship between health and politics. What's the role of health professionals in legislating in conflict zones? So
Okay.
their role.
Okay, let me answer the first question first. It has been said, and I sort of agree with that statement. It has been said that Israel is an army that has a state. And it is the armed forces that dictate what happens to the state. And in that sense, whatever the armed forces needs or wants, decides, that is eventually filters through as legislature. Now, the Palestinian minority in Israel has now 12 members in the Knesset, in the parliament, which is about half of what we should be having in the parliament. One of those is a physician, Ahmed Tibi. And the influence of those 12 on legislation, whether it is social or medical or whatever, is zero. Zero. They have no say whatsoever in what laws are passed in Israel. So I don't know whether that's enough for you or not, but the system is democracy, but with an absolute overwhelming decision making by the majority with essentially no attention to the minority. And now the second question.
The shift of powers in hospitals where
Yes.
Physicians are treating Jewish populations more than Palestinian ones, right?
Yeah, okay. At the level of caring for individual patients, there's very little difference in the sense that Israel prides itself on the lack of discrimination within the health system. In essence, the tradition of the physician respecting the life of the patient, at that level, there is no discrimination that I know of. There are some cases where the patient asks, I don't want an Arab to treat me. That happened and still happens on a rare occasion. Now, that's not where the differences are. The differences are essentially in the accessibility and the outreach of the services. There are, since Israel was established, there hasn't been a single hospital established in a Palestinian community. Not one. And there are very few. There is, in Israel, we have a prepaid medical insurance scheme that is really better than lots of other countries. And we benefit from that. But when you come to such issues as the accessibility of the services, first of all, if you don't speak Hebrew, then you have a problem. Except on weekends, when most of the staff who do the weekend duty are Palestinians. Then if you don't speak Arabic, you have a problem. And so to be more serious about this, the outreach of the services, for example, in most Jewish cities, there are such things as a Center for Women's Health, a Center for Child Health, a center which means a full-bodied service with all the specialists that are needed. There's essentially none of that kind of developed top-level care available in any of the Arabic communities. We are allowed to go and use that in the Jewish cities. But again, if the accessibility issues in terms of physical accessibility and in terms of cultural accessibility, these are issues that are quite serious.
Thank you. Dr. Hariri?
Situation in Syria, I think that our friends, our colleagues and brothers in Palestine are living in luxury comparison to Syrian situation. If you are a patient and you'd like to go to regime side, you will be kidnapped and killed. Cancer patients don't have access to any chemotherapy or any radiotherapy, or especially in BCH area. Chronic disease don't have access to any health facility. By the way, all of health facility in Syria now free of charge for all Syrians in opposition control areas, because the NGOs are covering the cost of all of this, and even the cost of the worker, in which maybe not that much, but it's to some extent keep patient feeling safe. But vaccination, there is some campaigns which is run by UN, which is some NGOs are working on. Chronic disease, as I said, are suffering. No treatment for a lot of patients, especially those chronic disease, because no way, no access to take this medication in. Patient could be, if it's intubated in the ICU, which happened, and me myself, I did it many times. I have a lot of patients coming. We are overwhelmed with patients coming with very limited area. In Aleppo, for example, we have 7 ICU beds only serving 300,000 patients under intensive attack. That means at least you have, in one day, more than 10 patients will be admitted to the ICU. We many times stop the machine for a patient who is alive and let him die peacefully, because I believe that there is another patient could be survived, and we lost hope from this patient. Unfortunately, this is what's happening. Many times in the ER, in the emergency room, I kept patient alive to die peacefully because I don't have ability to treat him. I don't have staff to treat him. Many patient has been treated in the corridor. Last month, brain surgery done on the floor with gloves to evacuate subdural hematoma because no place to take the patient to the theater. No theater at that date. In my hospital, we have 3 operating rooms. We did 6 operations in one time, in 3 operating rooms. This is the situation in Syria. I really would like to be asylum seeker in Gaza Strip, maybe.
So we'll take
If they
more.
accept me, I will be happy.
Hopefully the situation will change. So there are questions in the back. Let's take.
Hi, my name is Noor. I'm from California. I'm a labor and delivery nurse in California.
Could you raise your voice?
Sure. I'm a labor and delivery nurse from California. I'm Palestinian. I have a question for Dr. Hatem. I would actually like to ask you a little bit about touching on the different types of obstacles that Palestinians face in different areas, for example, A, B, and C. I know that you touched on Palestinians in Israeli territory and how they are much better off than Palestinians in the West Bank and also the Gaza Strip. One thing I would like you to touch on is the effect of mobility and on these Palestinians and their access to healthcare, and also in the Gaza Strip, how the blockade affects nutrition. Two things, nutrition and the restriction of mobility, particularly that effect on healthcare.
Okay. We'll take another question as well.
You have to translate.
Hi, my name is Inji Saleh. My question is mainly for Dr. Hariri about the role of the UN and in the Syria crisis. I actually work for the UN. I work for UNICEF for the water, sanitation, and hygiene section, which is very much linked to the health care system and to the health and well-being of people, let alone in fragile states and in conflict areas. You keep on saying that the UN works for the regime and collaborates with the regime.
This is not me, I said. It is
know.
Guardian.
But no, let me continue. The fact
to
of
make
the matter
things clear,
is,
please.
the fact of the matter is, the United Nations is made up of member states. It cannot operate in a country unless it is invited by the government of that country to operate. Every day, I feel an obligation towards my colleagues who put their lives on the line every day in Syria and in other conflict zones in order to provide services and support to people who are suffering and dying every day. So the point is that every day we are faced with a challenge, and that's the question for you. We have to answer a question every day. Do we operate and cooperate with a government that is highly tyrant and unjust and involved in killing of civilians, or would it be better that we pack and leave and not provide any services at all? Is it better to stay and offer whatever help we can, or to leave. Because this is the choice that my colleagues are faced with every day. Dr. Mazen probably knows that 4 of my colleagues were bombed in Somalia last year. They were targeted and bombed. One of my colleagues, who I personally knew, was bombed in Syria in September of 2015. Those people actually do care. They work through, and in the areas where they are, that are not operated, that are not under the government's control, they actually have to operate through other NGOs and through other agencies that can have access to these areas.
Okay,
I mean,
so
it's a choice.
Yeah.
What would you, as a doctor who is operating in Syria and as a Syrian, choose? Is it better for the UN to pack and
Got
leave,
the question, Angie.
or
I
to
will
stay and
answer
help?
with maternal view.
Okay, so let's first take the question to Dr. Hariri and Dr. Hatem, then Dr. Hariri, then we'll take more questions. And last questions where I'm being pointed out, I'm sorry. But our guests are available to get more questions after the session is over. So we'll answer these 2 questions, and colleagues will stay for more questions from the colleagues if they want to come. Doctor, in short.
Okay, I'll be short. The questions that you answered are actually all answered to some level in the paper that I have, but let me just say that the effect of mobility, that's a very, very significant item in terms of the West Bank and Jerusalem. In the West Bank, there are over 530 checkpoints, and it's a known fact, I don't have the statistics, but it's known fact that women give birth at the checkpoints, and very ill patients in ambulances are held back and die there and so it is an ongoing really impediment to the Palestinians in their attempt to take care of themselves. Okay? Yeah. Now, the Gaza, the nutritional issue, the Israeli armed forces, and I believe everybody knows that one. The Israeli armed forces calculated how much it takes to keep the average person in Gaza, to keep him at the survival level in terms of nutrition without starving to death. And that's what they allow to cross the border. Just enough to keep them at the edge of starvation. And the last thing really relates to what my colleague mentioned here, the fact that patients who need tertiary level care, for example, chemotherapy and X-ray therapy for cancer patients and so on, they have to exit Gaza because that's not available there. To exit Gaza, you need a permit. A permit takes time, and you need to go through all kinds of bureaucracy. But the final point, once you are allowed and you at the border, you are interviewed, the family that comes, or the caregiver that goes with you, with the patient, is approached openly to collaborate and give information about his neighbors and his family, or otherwise you will not cross.
Wow.
Okay.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Hariri, you have the charge question. Go for it.
I'm so sorry to say that. I'm so astonished that you don't have only one access regime is the only way, which is illegal government, to take help to Syrians. Only this is your way. There is Security Council resolution, you know it, crossing border. I think is very clear. Very clear. It's very Security Council resolution asking UN to send medications and help for people in need in all areas. It's very strange to asking the killer permission to take medications and food for patients inside Syria. It's very shame to say that. You're unable now to protect its convoy, which is targeted by Russian forces, and all of you know that. And no words even condemning for this convoy, which is UN convoy. MSF hospital in Al-Ma'arra, it is targeted and destroyed, and one of our colleagues has been killed in Syria, and no voice from, even from United Nations. It is shame. It is very shame. I'm sorry to say that.
Thank you, Dr. Hariri. The topic is needs days and days, as I mentioned, to discuss. But we have to end because the next session is coming on board. But we need to leave also thinking about our role, people who work in public health in this, the role of the international community, the role of citizens here on how to impact governments and to help. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and
Thank you so much.
the colleagues are here for more questions.
Just a quick announcement.